Yeah, GPT-3, people are worrying that GPT-3 is going to make this worse, because people will use GPT-3 to generate a lot of
to generate a whole lot of media content that's biased and fake news, right?
Yeah.
That's
there, you know what? The segue to the symbol grounding problem should be that. The reason I believe that that's not going to work is because GPT-3 is ungrounded. Same reason Searle's argument, Chinese room argument, works, which is that and the same reason Turing's test in the verbal form, if conducted by a computer only, in other words, just symbol manipulation, I say it wouldn't pass the Turing test. You just can't. With just symbol pushing, you can't get something that for a lifetime can do verbally everything that a human can do. You can fool people for a while, but you can't. It's not really doing the thing. It's not really doing what we do with words. It's just imitating what we do with words and manipulating words the way we manipulate words. We understand what words mean. There's a connection between Apple and that stuff out there and all the stuff you do with that, with apples, etc. And the meaning of apple is that, and not tons of texts that use the word apple in a lot of different contexts. You can produce a good imitation of that. We already had that with latent semantic indexing. Just the power of conjunction, the power of, I don't deny its power in contextual analysis, but if you, for example, you had latent semantic indexing, which is way before DPT3 or whatever it was. It could mark essays by matching them to essays that are already marked, and it knows what the mark is. It could mark essays just as reliably as real markers. That just goes to show that essay marking is a pretty unreliable thing. But by just taking the co-occurrences of words and the co-occurrences of words in the paragraphs, etc., they called it latent semantic indexing because they said this is semantics. It's meaning. It's not meaning. It's meaningless symbol crunching. That's what computing is. And so the symbol grounding problem, which is actually of all of the stuff that I've tried to do, the only thing that caught on was the symbol grounding. It's always being cited. And very disappointingly, because if I read into the articles that cite it, they don't get it, or most of them don't get it. But the symbol grounding problem is that if you look in a dictionary, and let's say you take a regular English dictionary, a word you don't know. If you look it up and you see the definition, do you now know the meaning of the word? Only if you know the meaning of the words in the definition. Supposing you don't, well, then you look them up too, and so on and so forth. But it obviously can't go on forever. It can't be definitions all the way down. Something has to break the circle of word defined by other words or combinations of other words. The symbol grounding problem is that somehow something other than words has to give meaning to a sufficient number of words some other way, so that the rest of it can be done by definitions, etc. And we work on that in my lab. We work on the dictionaries, dictionary grounds. We work also on what I think grounds the meaning, and that's sensory motor category learning. We teach participants in the lab to recognize patterns, really. Very difficult ones where there's an infinite number of members of the category, an infinite number of non-members, and they're very confusable. You've got to learn which is which. And some do and some don't, or some do sooner and some do later. And what happens with the ones who learn it, and this is, in a sense, the most interesting part, is not only can they now categorize correctly, which is what you want, but their perception changes. They see the members and the non-members of the category as looking, if it's visual, as looking more different once they know the category than they did before. We show this, and we have models that say what changes in their heads, and that something has to change, that makes this perceptual change. It's grounding symbols in perception. If you like Turing terms, in robotic activity. because robots have in sensors and effectors.
I get it.
Processing.
I think I get this. But there are some differences in opinion of what computation means. Now, it's probably got a lot of history behind it, and the way that the term was used in the early days is probably different from the way people see it today. People have computers on their desks, they have them in their hands and in their pockets, and pretty soon in their heads, right?
Yeah.
But so... I mean, other than our biological wetware. So, I mean, when people think of the word computation, they think whatever it is that's going on inside computers today is computation. And that includes cognitive computing and quantum computing in the future.
Well,
and
quantum computing is another story. But okay, so you said what people used to think and what they think now. I think
that because there seems to be a debate. Some people disagree with you around the idea that computation doesn't get us there, but I think it's just a matter of semantics in a lot of cases.
Well, it's definitely a matter of semantics. Symbol grounding is about semantics, but I don't think it's semantics about computation. I'm an orthodox Turing Church Gödel on and Kolmogorov and Fomin and everybody who worked on computation. Formally, we know what computation is. It was in fact, the Church Turing thesis was that when mathematicians are doing what they call informally computation, what is it that they're doing? And it's what a Turing machine does. It's manipulating symbols based on their...
Like a universal Turing machine can do?
Either one. It doesn't matter. The point is, there's a universal one has to have a memory component, but what computation, even in a universal computing machine, is a universal Turing machine, is symbol manipulation. You have rules, syntactic, which means meaningless rules that say if you see a 0, put out a 1. That's what it boils down to. Okay, that's computation. It's a nuclear weapon. Church Turing thesis, the weak Church Turing thesis was right. That is, in fact, what mathematicians are doing when they're computing. And if it can be done by a mathematician computing, then it can be done by a Turing machine. And if it can't be done, and if it can be done by a Turing machine, if it can't be done by a Turing machine, it can't be done by a mathematician computing. That may be some other way, but not by computing. And that's and that's the weak Church Turing thesis. The strong one says not only did it capture what it is that mathematicians' brains are doing when they're computing, it also, computation can simulate just about everything in the universe.
Including our brains?
Including our brains and including our bodies, because simulation is also just symbol manipulation. All it is a bunch of squiggles and squaggles, as Searles puts it, that can be systematically interpreted in a certain way. But that interpretation holds in the case of computation. For example,
including our ability to ground symbols?
Well, listen, I'm grounding symbols when I'm using symbols and relating them to the world. When a computer is passing the Turing test and it's got a whole bunch of symbols that it's crunching in order to produce the output of the computer, it's not doing semantics. It's not doing the world. It's not making it's not making connection between apple and apples. It's making a connection between apples and things you can say about apples. And not even that, because saying is more than just squiggling. It's uninterpreted syntactic versions. It's like what I said about latent semantic analysis. It's not semantic.
Let me ask you this. Let's just say we fed like a multimodal media into the Turing machine as well. That included three-dimensional video and like extremely high resolution. That we, to say, a billion by a billion pixels, except three-dimensional as well. And we had audio and all the text and everything. And so they had such a rich, multimodal forms of media being fed into the Turing machine that it could use to generate a reality at a definition that was comparable to what our senses could take in and feed our brain.
Okay, this is the contemporary notion of what computation is, etc., etc. Remember that the robot that passes the robotic version of Turing's test has got a bunch of stuff in it that is not computation. It's got, at the very least, its sensors and its effectors are not computers. They're not just going squiggle squoggle. They're in fact taking energy and transducing it, etc. So what you just described is just a way of building a robot. Fine, of course, I agree that a robot, since we are just biorobots, must be able to pass the Turing test, and it must be able to generate all of our capacities, and in some way, called the hard problem, also our feeling. So this as soon as you say multimodal, you've left computation. It's not computation anymore. Let me remind you that what is a virtual reality? If you take a person with eyes and with a hand and hands, and you generate there, let's say you're simulating an airplane. He thinks he's walking up the ramp, stepping into the cockpit, turning on the airplane and flying it off to Chicago, okay? But it's not. It's all just virtual stuff, okay? Now, what do you want to say about that? He is a real person with real senses. You're tricking his senses, and his real brain feels as if the same way as it would if it were walking up the ramp, etc., etc. But what does that show? So you can do it with the real thing, or you can do it by tricking the senses, but it's still sensory input going into a real brain. So that virtual reality you cannot help yourself to in talking about this multimodal thing. What you can do, and I did say simulate, the strong Church-Turing thesis says that anything can be simulated. You can simulate, this is Searle and stuff too, you can simulate a waterfall computationally. Either literally in the computer, you just say, I have a waterfall going here, probe it to see, for example, what the water pressure is and blah, blah, blah. You'll get all your answers. I can also simulate, for example, all right, let me give a better one. I can simulate the planetary system. I can have a simulation in which there's Jupiter and Pluto, etc., gravitation, all of that simulated. It's all there so well, you capture, the Church-Turing thesis is right, you can capture it to such a close approximation that you can predict the precession of the perihelion of Mercury under these conditions. If the simulation has all the bits in it, you've got that. But it's not planets, and it's not rotating. It's just a simulation, okay? A simulation, it's like an oracle that gives you answers about what's happening in the world. But if you can't get into the simulation and fly to Chicago with it.
Yes, so you can't fly to the actual point of Chicago.
You can't fly anywhere. You're I know what you're doing.
Let's talk about flight simulators, because people use those to actually learn how to fly.
Yes,
the difference is that they don't die if they crash, right?
Absolutely.
So they're very useful.
I'm not denying that they're useful. I'm just saying what they really are. What they really are is computer programs that produce stimuli to the eyes and to the hands that can train you the same way that flying does. They give you the input, right? But so what? I mean, so what? The Church-Turing thesis is remarkable. You can design a rocket without ever having to build it. You can just simulate the air conditions, etc. And in the end, the first prototype that you actually build will work because all of that stuff worked. But all that stuff wasn't rockets flying. It was just simulations. It was just the power of computation to simulate anything.
Well, I guess this comes down to whether you think a machine can understand. Now you're using the term computation to not include what's happening when you're processing multimodal media, and it's just pure symbol manipulation, as in only like reading from text to text, right? Do you think machines will ever be able to truly understand?
Could you please define a machine for me? And if you give me Turing's definition, you're not defining machine. You're defining an all-purpose device that can simulate any machine computationally. What is a machine physically?
Well, at the moment, machines, I guess, are running on classical computers, most of them anyway, and that they can do amazing things. They can process video, they can process like sound, they can process tactile input. Some of them do have sensors and actuators I'd put
The
that all
sensors
underneath,
and the sensors and the actuators are not computers.
but they're part of the
Okay,
machine.
they're input to the machine and they're output from the machine. But wait a minute, you didn't define machine for me, and I wouldn't define it your way. I think, of course, machines can do all of these things because machines aren't. Computers are not the only kind of machine.
Yep.
I'm a machine and you're a machine. We have biochemical processes going on in us, physiological ones, mechanical ones. That's not computation. Computation is symbol manipulation, zeros and ones, as guided by actually the structure of the. In the end, a stored program computer is actually a self-configuring physical device that treats zeros and ones differently depending on the zeros and ones that it got. So that's the way computation works. And it's an oracle in the sense that we can interpret it as meaning something, but what we interpret it as meaning, whether it's a flight to Chicago or the solar system or a waterfall or a glass of water, it's not that. It's not that. We know it. We can look at it and we see it's not that. We only get confused when we're talking about the mind and we say, well, maybe in the case of the mind, it's really a mind, really feeling. No, it's just squiggling and squaggling remarkably. It's a nuclear weapon.
Right. When we look at the way that we process visual stuff, there seems to be a hierarchy that's going on. We can see, like, at the bottom of the hierarchy, there's very simple lines being processed, or angles, or sort of outlines, or whatnot. And then at another layer, they're added together, and they begin to sort of resemble something like a worm or a letter, right? Or an object in the environment, like a tree. And this is all contingent on what kind of animal is doing the processing. Like a frog will notice slivery things that wriggle that way, and a cat will notice things that sort of bounce around, and humans will notice other faces a lot more readily. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of things going on there. But is that symbol manipulation? When we're taking sensory input and then and then processing that, if we really drill down to what's actually going on in the brain, would you consider that not symbol manipulation?
I don't. I would be very surprised if the brain turned out to be a digital computer doing symbol manipulation. Well, it's doing what it is. It's a physical process. Some of it is analog. For example, you know that your retina points that are beside one another on your retina are preserved at many of these stations up into the brain. So in other words, they're carrying over an analog copy of the surface of the sensor. That's not right. Computation.
Yeah. Okay.
That's more non. And the same thing applies to.
So there's analog processing going on there.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen when it's being converted into digital representation.
Yes, and by the way, an analog processor, analog machines are machines. So it's not the only machine is not a digital computer or a Turing machine.
Is it the resolution?
No,
the compression that happens when you convert things into digital, that's the issue there?
No, actually, it's what you need for the general category of machine is you just have to say a machine is any causal system. The solar system is a machine. It just means that under certain inputs, it's going to do certain things internally and certain things are going to come out. And we're machines, for sure. So we're to a great extent analog machines, and things like that you've heard about the famous mirror neurons, right?
Yep.
Along with your line detectors and cell detectors, etc. There are detectors of when they're output detectors when I make this movement, this particular movement here, and when you make the same movement. Okay, it seems as if there's a mapping. By the way, because of the Church-Turing thesis, everything that I describe as being done in analog could be done to as close approximation as you like digitally. That's not denied, right? But that doesn't mean that it's done digitally, and doing it analog is another kind of a physical process. And if it turns out, for example, that I think the hard problem is really hard, but if it turns out what it is about the brain that generates feeling is based on biochemical properties, not computational properties, then that's the end of the story. It means that it's biochemistry machine, a biochemical machine that is generating feeling and not a digital computer. And it's not a feather in the cap. But I'll answer the question you asked before. Could we simulate digitally that biochemical system? Of course we can. Just like we can simulate the solar system. It's just that it wouldn't be feeling. It would just be a simulation of feeling, any more than a solar system would be moving.
Do you think that there's quantum processing going on in the brain that aids in it being able to, like, gives it the ability to process analog stuff?
No, I don't. And I think the Penrose and the what's his name, Hammeroff, etc. Stuff is
the
nonsense.
microtubule stuff. Yeah, but that's not the only view on how quantum processing is done. Yeah, in the brain.
In the end, I should admit that I don't know. But I have had a rule of thumb that I've used, which is that whenever somebody comes to explain something cognitive to me and uses anything quantum, then I'm dealing with a crackpot and I don't want to hear anymore. Okay, call me closed-minded.
The word has been used for very strange purposes. That's true. So I will leave the quantum stuff there. Except like okay, let's toss the word. Well, actually, I will just bring up one more thing. Do you think a quantum Turing machine can do anything that a normal universal Turing machine can't do?
I don't know. I really don't know. But let me bring it a little closer to home, because there is no quantum Turing machine today. We're talking sci-fi.
Yep.
We're just talking. But Penrose's argument. He used Searle, by the way, the Chinese room. He said it's partly because of Searle's Chinese room argument and, in the end, the symbol grounding problem that I think that classical computation is not the right model for what's going on in the head. And so he turned to quantum. But the fact is, he could have stayed in classical mechanics. I mean, biochemistry doesn't require, not at this level, doesn't require quantum physics. Ordinary chemistry can be done just with classical Newtonian physics. And that would have been enough to defeat the Chinese room. In other words, if you needed something more than classical computation, you could have already just reached into the analog world of gravitation and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Or just classical mechanics.
What about cybernetics? Does that help? Like, if we were to develop a robot with both computation and cybernetic capabilities.
What is cybernetic capability?
The ability to process analog signals. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, so I don't know what process there means, because mostly what you do with analog signals is just causality. But anyway, if you have a hybrid robot that's part computational and part analog, you have a hybrid robot. I don't know about where the cybernetic gets into it, but you have a hybrid robot. A robot is already a
Signal
robot.
Processing. I mean, yeah, that's it. Look, I'm no expert at cybernetics, I'll tell you that. But it has been a word used to talk about how we process signals, I guess.
Yeah, well, signals are the signals I'm interested in, the sensory inputs to the five senses, the modes, the multimodality thing we were talking about. That's physics and biophysics coming in. And then what happens once the signal gets in, you could in principle convert it immediately to bits that go, like you could take the retina and just turn it into a bitmap or whatever, and do everything else with the bitmap. It would be incredibly uneconomical. I'll give you a good example that was used classically by psychologists to refute the claim that computation. What is it that they weren't refuting that computation was? That you could have analog processes in the mind. This is Shepard's experiment. Are you familiar with this? It's called mental rotation. What you do is you show, this has been done lots of different ways, but you show subjects a screen with a two-dimensional projection of an unfamiliar three-dimensional stick figure, right? A three-dimensional one, like a hypercube, but deformed in lots of different ways. You show the two-dimensional projection of the three-dimensional figure, and you ask the subject to do the following. I'm going to show you two projections, one after the other. Sometimes it'll be two different shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it'll be one shape and then the same shape in a different
angle,
rotated. Yep. You just tell me whether it's same or different. So they pay no attention to the trials where it really is a different shape. But with the ones where the subject says it's the same shape rotated, they take the reaction time. And it turns out that the reaction time of the subject is proportional to the degree of rotation. As if their head was doing, in order to do this, it gets one input and then another one, and then the brain sort of holds the first one and twists the other one to see if they match. And if it has to twist it more, it takes longer. Now, this could be done by a Turing machine, just, with coordinates, etc. But the correlation, but it would be obviously artificial. The correlation between reaction time and degree of orientation would be built in as a rule. The bigger the angle of rotation, the longer it's going to take you to respond. But it would be arbitrary.
Processing.
Whereas in the case of an analog, it's clear, it's obvious why it happens. It's because this is going on. It takes longer to do this than to do this. That's the kind of thing that your intuition should use when you're saying, yeah, it could be done by computation, but what would be the advantage? In fact, it would probably be a bit big. I have a feeling that in order to do mental rotation computationally, digital, with, say, translating everything into Cartesian coordinates, formally Cartesian, and then doing the calculation with some formulas about closed figures, blah, 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 you could do it, but it wouldn't. But it wouldn't show anything. I mean, it would just be another proof of the Church-Turing thesis that you can simulate just about anything. You can't simulate continuity. You can only approximate it, but you can, right?
Right, because there's no transition between one state and the other. Would you think the universe is granular or continuous? I'll just flip that one in there.
I think that if it's granular, it's, let's put it another way. For some, I'm just a psychologist. For some cognitive functions, our resolution capacity is too weak to take it all the way down to granularity. So for us, it feels and looks continuous, but in reality, it's not. So what? And the vice versa. The alternative is true also. You can make something, you can perceptually distort things in order to make things look granular that are actually continuous. These are the questions that a mere cognitive science pygmy like me deals with. What the universe is anybody's guess. I'm not a physicist.
It certainly looks analog from where we stand. So yeah, like back to your question. Do you think, I mean, it sounds like you'd agree that understanding would be capable in machines that had the right sort of anatomy to process? Yes,
they have to have the right hardware. One of the cardinal features, we didn't talk about it, but one of the most central features of computation is that it's implementation independent. It's the independence of the software from the hardware. But when it comes to symbol grounding and analog processes, some of the stuff we can do is in virtue of the hardware. Not the hardware of computation, because that's irrelevant, but the hardware of the actual process. You talk about processing, that's ambiguous too. I mean, this is mental rotation. If we literally had a little space in the head where when you get an input from the two shapes, it produces a sort of a spatial, a three-dimensional spatial configuration, and for a while, if you put a second one in, you can compare it to the first one. That kind of processing is not computation. It's processing, but it's analog, and that's hardware. So and whereas for the computation, the hardware is irrelevant. For some things that, remember, Turing test is about what people can do and organisms can do. For some of the things we can do, we need analog processing, not just digital. And moreover, it has to be grounded.
Yeah, right. That seems to go beyond what the normal Turing test does. Like, you don't get to jump in through the screen and check to see if what's on the other end is a biological human. You don't get to open its head. You don't get to see whether it's only digital.
You don't get to open its head. That's true. When I went like this, I did something that cheated. Okay, you can't open its head. But in the end, this is a longer story. In the end, it doesn't make any difference, because if what you insist on in the head is something that is identical to what you would find in a brain, you can get that. You can generate that too, not biochemically, but you can generate it to the senses, and it wouldn't help.
Behavioralistically.
Pardon me?
Behavioralistically.
No. What I'm saying is that Turing's criterion is whatever you can observe. Normally, when we're talking about, most of the Turing testing is about the behavior of the whole organism and not its cells. But you can include that if you insist that you want to have the something that is indistinguishable in its cell behavior. You could kludge that as well. As far as I'm concerned, passing the robotic version, not the verbal version, but the robotic version of the Turing test, it requires stuff that's not just computation. That's the main challenge. If we can pass the robotic Turing test, if we have a model that can do what you and I are doing forever, right, or for long enough, so that we've answered all the questions. The rest, is it made out of the right stuff? What would we learn out of that? I mean, some people say, I want a model, but I want it to be neurally realistic. I say I want a model that's capable of passing the robotic Turing test. I don't care what's going on inside it.
There are always practical limitations to how you can test things. I mean, when we're talking about using the Turing test practically, we haven't got lifetimes to do it in order to see whether
we discussed this already. I don't think we need it. I think you and I, if you were really Turing testing me, you wouldn't require a lifetime. And if I wasn't really capable of passing the Turing test for a lifetime, you'd find it out pretty soon.
Yeah.
I just insist that what we're talking about is not... Turing, in one of his throwaway sentences in the 1950 article, said that I predict that by 50 years from now, we'll be able to fool 70% of the judges, 20%, for 10 minutes. Okay, that was not the Turing test. That was just a prediction about how. Moreover, the verbal version of the Turing test is not the only Turing test. I may be wrong about this, but if Turing were here now and you asked him, by the Turing test, do you really mean that cognition is just computation and it's just a computer you need to do all of the symbol manipulation and that will give you a mind? He would say no. He would say no. The robotic version of the Turing test is the Turing test too, and my criterion is totally indistinguishable in what it can do, and we can do a lot more than just verbalize. Moreover, there's a connection between our words and the world. That's part of the Turing test too, the robotic Turing test. But for the robotic Turing test, I would ask Turing, do you really think that all the work is being done by a computer in there? And I think he'd say no, there's no need for it to be I think it can be simulated by a computer. The whole robot can be simulated. The robot's world can be simulated. But what's going on in a robot that's passing the human Turing test need not be just computation. I may be wrong, but I think that's what he would say. Remember that he brought the whole thing up in order to be able to slip a computer in at some point when he was just testing, is it a man or a woman, right? And the idea, his criterion was, is it totally indistinguishable to you? Can you just not tell them apart? So first you're talking to real people and you're trying to figure out whether a man or a woman, and at some point it's neither a woman or a man, it's a computer, and it keeps on going. And he didn't say for 10 minutes or whatever, it just keeps on going. You talk to it and you're trying to figure out if it's a man or a woman, and it's neither. It's a computer. That was how it got slipped in, but that doesn't rule out robots.
You mentioned you mentioned that there is like a few different levels of Turing test.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, I'll give them to you. T0 is a toy, namely a chess playing program or whatever. It's nothing. It's not a Turing test. It's just a tiny fragment of what people can do. It becomes closer to life size when it's the verbal Turing test, which is you can talk about anything as long as you want with it, and it never does anything that makes you think it's not another person, okay? That's the verbal version. And the robotic, so that's T2.
Right. What's
T0 is little T0, and then T2, there's no, I mean, I used to call it T1, but T0, just to remind you, there's nothing. It's a small t and it's just a toy. So
Okay.
T for toy. It becomes a Turing test TT when it's verbal, and TTT, three T's, is when it's verbal and robotic, and T4, TTTTT, is verbal, robotic, and neural similitude. It's the other thing that you asked for, which is that if you take it
Cognition.
apart, it's doing the right things. No,
Okay. Yeah.
cognition.
Sure.
This is all cognition. But when you take the hardware apart, you find something in there that corresponds to a real brain. You don't insist that it should be made out of flesh, but it should have, when you bang it on the right side, left side, it should get aphasia. When you bang it on the right side, it should not get aphasia and stuff like that. You want that, you can get that too.
Okay.
That's T4, but you don't need T4. And by the way, T4 is still synthetic. T5 would be made out of the right stuff, but I mean, at that point, who cares? What matters is T3, which is the robotic one, because it grounds the T2 into the world.
Okay. That's interesting. Now, often, like when people refer to ideal artificial intelligence or what the grand goal is, they refer to it as artificial general intelligence. The word generality in this context is borrowed from psychology and the way that they test humans for intelligence.
For the G factor.
Yeah, the G factor. Right.
Yeah, well, that's not okay. It's a misnomer, but it's close. The word is, I use a G word with you. I said generic. I said not an Einstein, but just sort of generic capacity. To pass T3, the robot, you have to be able to do what a sort of an average human being is expected to do. What we already know. Okay, it doesn't have to discover the theory of relativity, but it has to recognize objects, etc., etc. You can start talking about saying, well, what about people who are paralyzed or blind or whatever? Once you've got a generic human, you can start reducing it and seeing what's left. But the Turing idea is to try to get it all first, and then worry about could I do it with less resources. And all means do everything that a generic human can do. Now the G factor is simply, it just comes out of psychometrics. People were testing intelligence. You can test verbal intelligence. You can do, well, I shouldn't say intelligence. Intelligence just means performance capacity, cognitive performance capacity. And so you test mathematical performance capacity, you test spatial orientations of performance capacity, verbal, etc., etc. You take a bunch of different tests in each of these categories. You give them to a bunch of people, so you get this matrix of people by scores on different tests. And what happens is that there is these tests are correlated, some more than others, okay? If they're negatively correlated, just flip the test, because we're really interested in positive correlation. It turns out that when you have this manifold of all of these intercorrelations, there is one factor all of the tests have varying loads on them. So for a music test will have a high load on musical input and not much on verbal, etc. The general factor is the intercorrelation of all of those things, and that produces a general factor. It's not a direct factor, it's something that's inferred from the correlations between all the particular factors, and it seems to be the one that predicts performance on every test. So if you're high in general, you'll be high in performance, you'll be high in musical ability, you'll be high blah blah blah. If you're lower, then you're lower. That's the general factor, but it doesn't. Nobody knows what's behind the general factor. It's just the psychometric.
That's the part of my point. It seems to be like, it's inherited this sort of behavioralistic stance in testing for it that psychology uses in human. Like, the psychologists don't carve open people's heads and check out what's going inside their brain. They test behavioralistically. And so my question was going to be something along the lines of like, would a test for understanding, more of a white box test, be more useful than a test for generality. And I'm wondering why we're continuing to use the word generality in defining what it means to be an ideal intelligence, because that's
I
just
don't
really
know.
a behavioralistic.
But what do you mean by a test of understanding? T2 is a test of understanding. It's words in and words out. Do you understand? Searle said
Yeah,
when
but
you
it's a
do it in Chinese,
behavioralistic test.
why is it
What I'm
behavioralist?
hoping is that we'll develop a theory of understanding that's testable, not just
But
by its output, but by its pattern.
but what are you imagining there, Adam? I mean, you said behavioristic. Turing is a behaviorist. He says, I'm interested in performance
Mm.
capacity, right?
Hmm.
I'm doing more than a behaviorist does, because a behaviorist is just interested in what history of reinforcements will make you do this rather than that. Whereas he's interested in everything you can do. But he said, once I have a model that can generate everything you can do, not just
Mm.
verbally, but also in the world, interaction with objects, etc., then I've explained your mind. He says. Now, I haven't proved that you actually have a mind, right? You may, if there's no consciousness there, if you're not feeling anything, then it's just a black box doing this stuff. But
Mm.
I have done something that no one can do better than. In other words, that's why he says, if you can no longer tell my model, my robot, apart from a person, what are you holding out for? T4? That's
Do you think T4 is unreasonable for us to
well.
graduate?
But what do you learn from T4? I mean, really,
You learn
if you
about what's
knew
going
me.
on inside the machine, like
Okay,
more.
so if you knew me for 20 years, I
Mm.
mean, we'd been gone through life together, and then on the 20th year, you found this out. I mean, what would you learn? What would you know? That it was all an illusion. I wasn't really what?
Say you learned we were in a simulation.
Oh God. Let me put that to rest right away, okay? One of the bad effects of everybody having a computer and simulations and stuff like that is that you got it in The Matrix, the movie, which was completely absurd. In the old days, when the difference between appearance and reality was clear, in other words, you could say, right now I think I see a room with a piano, etc., etc., but maybe it's an illusion. Maybe, I'm hallucinating, or maybe it's a mirage. So that was the distinction between what was really out there and what seemed to be out there. And it was something, right? How it seemed was in here, and how it was out there. But with this idiocy of saying, what if we were in a simulation? What on earth does that mean? What we've because of the strong church Turing thesis, anything can be simulated. So, for example, my planetary simulation has Mercury in it. Okay, Mercury is in my simulation. But what does that mean? That there's a little thing there that's moving? No. There's a bunch of squiggling and squaggling going on there that we humans can interpret systematically as Mercury moving. That's the strong church Turing thesis. That is not Mercury living in a virtual reality. It's just computational simulation. Simple. And the reason that it seems like more is because of these mixing up of virtual reality, simulation, real, etc. The kids who spent too much time in front of their computers started thinking they didn't. I had a difficult summer when I was 14, when somebody living on my street, a clever kid, Mitchell Lazarus, said, "I'm going to ruin your summer. Are you ready for
Mm-hmm.
this?" And what he gave me was what we were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation, the skepticism. He says, "How can you be sure that I'm really real here, etc., etc.? How do you know your parents are real?" And I went back, and he did ruin my Sandra. I hectored my parents. How could I know you're really real? You're telling me I have to do this, but how do I know that you even exist? Blah, blah, blah. That
And you
distinction,
ruined your parents' summer.
yeah, I ruined my parents' summer. But that distinction is lost on the people who say, remember that distinction based on how do I know you're real rather than just a figment of my imagination? You, whether you are real or a figment. Now we're contemplating, what if I'm a figment in your imagination?
Hmm.
That's nonsense. That's
Well, I hope
complete
you don't.
nonsense.
If I'm a figment in your imagination, like like a pawn in a Red Queen's sort of mind, for instance, to borrow a metaphor from Alice in Wonderland, if the Queen suddenly decides to forget about me, then I cease to exist.
Yes, but you didn't get what I was saying. You flipped it back to the old one. Can I say about myself, me, that I'm just a figment of your imagination? Now, what does the Queen have got to do with that?
Well, Alice, if she thought that she was in a figment of the Queen's imagination, she still felt like she was a person. She still had this inner experience in herself, and she still had her agency as far as she felt it.
Well, she may or may not. It depends on whether she was moving or not. But remember, out of body experiences and stuff like that, we're free to have them. But that doesn't mean we go out of our bodies. It just means that we can hallucinate being out of our bodies. I can hallucinate, and I can imagine anything. I can, with some effort, imagine a square circle. I can imagine stuff that's impossible too. So imagine it. You know, it's just, I used to think I could imagine a scale that had more than 12 semitones or more than, let's say, 8 full tones. And I could hum it to myself, but whenever I tried to hum it aloud, it just didn't work somehow. But in my mind, it worked.
Wow.
Okay.
I love that sort of music. Like gypsy music that has way more semitones than and Turkish music, for instance, Egyptian stuff. That's. I mean, I used to think it sounded crazy a
Yeah,
little
but it's
bit,
not
but
that. It's not that, Adam. It's not that. I was saying more than 12 semitones, which means well-tempered semitones in an octave. Turkish music doesn't have more semitones. It has more. It has smaller intervals, something
yeah,
smaller
sure,
than a
yeah,
semitone. But
yeah.
so that's not what's. But
Hexademi
in my head,
semitones.
I thought I could do it,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
squaring a circle and trisecting an angle, etc. You do all kinds of stuff in your head, including imagining that not imagining that you're a figment in my imagination. That's easy. I mean, maybe you are a figment, but imagining that I'm a figment in your imagination. Well, I can, I can do that, but it's nonsense. If I, and right, it's
I mean,
nonsense.
a lot of people think a good mental exercise is to try and think of like at least 2 or 3 impossible things before breakfast. Just to train their mind to think out of the box, and maybe one day they'll stumble upon some ridiculous thing that ends up being true or useful.
Yeah, but more likely they're going to be like the patent officer who every day has to deal with people coming in to put a patent on their angle trisector, and then having to consult people to show where the fallacy is if it doesn't work.
Sure.
But at the
Okay.
same time, this is the inverse, to get back to veganism, it's the inverse of the chicken's fallacy. The chicken, in a battery hen thing, the chicken doesn't even want to live. But in a farm, the few remaining farmyard chickens who think that every day there's going to be another tomorrow, that's a fallacy. At one point they cut its neck, and the same thing applies to this stuff. I mean, in reverse, I could say, I lost my thread there, but there's other analogy there too. What was it? What was the analogy between the chicken fallacy and the illusion about the figment in the imagination? I
Uh,
have a problem. Adam. It's here 7:27, which is okay.
yep.
But at 7:45, I told you that Sindri died, my
Oh,
cat,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then no, wait, and then an elderly lady in my building asked me if I would take care of her very elderly dog, and at 7:45 I have an appointment to
Yeah,
walk
yeah, yeah,
Diamond.
yeah. That's fine. Hey, I'd like to ask you just before you go,
I
since
still
we've
have a
got a few
little
minutes.
time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What were you impressed by AlphaGo's ability to defeat the grand champions in Go? I mean, let's take this back. Were you impressed when Gary Kasparov was beaten by Deep Blue? Was that interesting to
It
you?
showed me why Turing was right to reject T0. Because a device that's wholly devoted to playing chess is not doing human cognition. And that means that it couldn't, one possibility is that it couldn't do well at chess, or it could mean that by means that we don't have, it can be better than a world champion.
Hmm. And then, like more recently, I mean, there are other games that were beaten, but the algorithm or the deep learning algorithm was used to develop AlphaGo, which defeated the grand champions in Go, which was
Yeah,
considered
yeah.
to be a much more difficult game for people to to master in general. And also, most of the people predicting when it would happen said it would happen at least 10 years later. So it seemed to happen a lot earlier than people thought.
Well, as you can guess already, I'm not much for predictions, how long it takes. But for me, the essence of that is that Go itself is computation. So it's not surprising that computation could master Go, because it is computation, right? It's not. It doesn't have a meaning. Chess doesn't have a meaning. All you have pieces have. There's certain moves they can make, and there's certain rules, etc. And the rest, and we know what the goal is. So I'm not surprised, since I believe in the Church-Turing thesis, that computation can do that. It can do much harder things than that. The reason, presumably, the poor world grandmaster Go grandmaster failed was because they don't do it just either they don't do it just computationally, or their computational resources are biologically limited, and so they're handicapped compared to this one. That's not surprising. It's still computation both ways. They're both doing computation.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Yeah,
that's not an insightful answer. It just explains why I'm not surprised one way or the other. Right. I wouldn't have been surprised if it never could do it because if it were true that chess draws on non-chess abilities in some way, and this game didn't try to model the non-chess abilities the way T3 does. T3 has to model everything, but it tried to do it in a special way. That's the reason why T0s are no good. It's a matter of degrees of freedom. There are horrible non-vegan things. I never use them. The expression about cats and skinning, things like that, I don't use them. But there are so many ways to do a toy task that there's no reason to put any weight on any particular way, and it may have nothing whatsoever to do with the way that people do it. T3 forces it to be the human way. And if it turns out that by using some arbitrary algorithm that no human uses or could use because it requires too much capacity, then it's not surprising that the algorithm beats the human.
Right. Yeah. But that's to say, maybe at some stage, the way that the human does it in its simple grounding ability could be plugged in, have this sort of pluggable architecture. We have the deep learning way of doing things, and you have the sort of completely alien way of doing things, X, Y, and Z. And then also the simple grounding way of doing things.
Okay, but the answer is always the same. You can simulate symbol grounding, but simulated symbol grounding is not grounded. It's just more squiggles and squaggles.
But I mean, okay, I think we agreed before that we could have machines do the symbol grounding problem as long as they had the right anatomy or the right machinery, right?
Yes, but if a robot grounds its symbols, it's really grounding its symbols. It's not a simulated robot. It's a real robot grounding real symbols. Let's say the symbols are words, and the words are about real objects. It can do all that stuff. That's part of T3, okay? If you simulate T3, right? If you do a simulated world, you have a simulated robot, you have the simulated robot grounded into simulated objects, and that's not grounded. That's just a big squiggle and squaggle machine.
But I'm wondering on your thoughts on whether we can plug in the grounding as a module to other aspects of cognition.
What does that mean? I mean, we have I can think in terms of robots.
Do you think there's parts in our brain that don't do grounding? Like, for instance, some form of processing that isn't grounding?
Yes,
or you think our brain is just grounding all the way from the bottom up?
No, I mean, grounding is not magical. It's simply finding the features of sensory motor inputs that allow us to distinguish the members from the non-members of the category, to name them, and then to string them together into propositions with subjects and predicates that define more categories. That's the way when you get higher in the dictionary, you can once you've grounded a certain number of categories, and we have estimates of how many, the rest can be really done by symbol combination. But when you talk about plugging the symbol grounding into what? Into a robot? What is it that you want to if you have a simulation of a robot, here I have a computer which is simulating a robot in a simulated world, and you're talking about taking that simulated robot in a simulated world and somehow plugging it into a real robot and then getting real grounding as a consequence. What on earth are you thinking of?
Well, what I don't know yet is whether the simple grounding issues. Okay, so the simple grounding processing can be plugged into a normal computational system such that they can work in cooperation. So
yes, you can take the symbol system, which is this simulated
processing.
robot in a simulated world, etc., and you can plug it into another symbol system, and you get another bigger symbol system, and
But the simple grounding system. I mean,
no, robots are ground. Let me put it another way. Ground, because it is simple. To ground language, the words in language, you have to ground them in robotic capacities, not simulations of robotic capacities, which is just more symbols, but real robotic capacities. I ground my Apple symbol in the stuff that I can do with apples, like recognize apples, name apples, eat them, feel them, grow them, etc. That's the grounding. Simulating that in a simulated world is just more squiggles and squaggles, ungrounded squiggles and squaggles.
right. But we could, okay, so we as people can, if we're trained enough, we can understand and ground what a deep learning system is doing.
Absolutely. In fact, that's what produces these illusions in teenagers with computers, etc., etc. We can project an interpretation, even a felt interpretation, onto symbols. That's why I said a computer is really an oracle that produces squiggles and squaggles that we can interpret. It's not random, obviously. You have to have the right algorithm to produce the right squiggles and squaggles, but they're still just squiggles and squaggles, and we can interpret them. So, for example, if a robot says to me, "I'm tired now," I know what that means. I can interpret it. And if the robot lies down, I said, "You see, he lay down because he was tired." But no, the robot, if it's not a T3 robot, if it's just a chatbot robot, it has no idea. It's emitted some squiggles and squaggles, and I projected an interpretation on it. It's all in my head.
Mm-hmm. Let me come at this another way. Another form of inquiry is to think about this in terms of distributed cognition. You're aware of Andy Clark and David Chalmers' stuff? Or you have to go?
Of course I am. We can take it up. We can take it up next. I now have 6 minutes to get ready for Diamond. I have to go.
That's fine.